you're in for a treat. Katharine Hayhoe is a world-renowned climate scientist who has been, yes, Alan, that hand clap is definitely in order. Who's I've watched from afar for many decades now, and I've had the great joy of getting to know her a little bit over the past few years. And not only is she a world-renowned climate scientist, but she's also a Christian with like a deep, deep abiding faith. And those things shouldn't be mutually exclusive, but for whatever reason, in this day and age, there's often a tension. So her ability to communicate the science to unlikely audiences that don't always have the sort of predisposition to be open, has been one of her superpowers. And when I worked for David Fenton back in the day, he recognized her back in 2012 as the premier climate communicator. So we often talk about climate scientists also as being siloed, often talking about, the uncertainties, the probabilities, and really leaving a lot to people's imaginations. And if folks did have a proclivity not to believe, many climate scientists make that possible. But Katharine somehow, even grounded in the deepest depths of the science, presents it in a way that's accessible, often, entertaining, and also just like from the heart. We have so many people that have these egos and this like talking down to you kind of format, and Katharine breaks that mold completely. She's one of the warmest, sweetest people that I've ever met. And when I conceived of this Climate Survivors project last year, she was the first person that I called to share about it in August. And she was the one that gave me the sense that this is a good idea. This is something with legs. She encouraged me to pursue it. And then we found ourselves in the living room of David Fenton over Climate Week. And we were all going around doing our introductions. It was like a climate salon. And one of those individuals who I'm hoping will join us, Sierra Coes, who started the Extreme Weather Survivors Network, which is now just getting underway, she shared in that meeting that that's what she was up to. And Katharine just turned to me and said, in front of the whole room, "That's what Claire is doing. That's what Claire," and it was just such an amazing moment. And since then, Sierra and I have worked closely. We brought together this amazing community. So without further ado, I just wanted to turn it over to you, Katharine, and just say that, feel free to format this as you like. I would like to leave ample time for questions at the end of your presentation. But aside from that, please take it away, and thank you.
Thank you, Clara. It's wonderful. I love the synergies because my favorite mantra these days is we can't do it alone, but we can do it together. And I just feel like whenever I get a chance to connect with people and hear what they're doing and hear how, how it supports or synergizes with what I'm doing or just encourages us, it's really incredible. And in fact, social science, I follow the social science very closely because I know that we can have the best physical science in the world, but if we don't understand how people interact with information, then we're going to get nowhere. And the social science says that one of the most encouraging things we can do to get people to take action on climate change is to give them examples and stories of what is already happening. So that's just so important to share what we're doing with each other and with other people we know. And these days, there'll be a lot of sort of doomsayers who'll be like, "Oh no, don't tell people what you were accomplishing because they'll think that we're all done." No, nobody will think that. Clara was mentioning that I'm also a Christian, so I'm not going to be speaking to you at all about that, but if anybody's curious about how Christians in the United States, and I say that with emphasis because outside the US, a colleague of mine and I have kind of a specialty in figuring out where climate denial outside the US comes from. And basically every example we can find outside the US came from the US. He lives in France, I'm Canadian, and everything that we've seen outside the US came from the US. So how did it become such a US issue? I have a short answer and a long answer for you in the chat here. If you're interested in the short answer, there's a really good article called "How Fossil Fuel Money Made Climate Change Denial the Word of God." Best article, in my opinion, I've read. But then there's a much longer book by a Notre Dame historian that begins with the American Revolution and goes all the way up till today, explaining how the US became progressively more anti-science over time. And the number one, if you had to summarize his book in one word, it would be politics. It is all about political ideology. Yeah, very light vacation reading. Exactly. Okay. But getting to what we are going to be talking about today, we are going to be talking about extreme weather. And I'm going to talk about the latest science of what we can and can't say about extreme weather. And then I'm going to bring in some highlights of what people are thinking and talking and hearing about the connections between climate change and extreme weather today based on recent polls. And then lastly, I'm going to conclude with how can we talk about extreme weather and use it to make what I think of as the head to heart connection. So increasingly on climate change, I feel like everything we have is up here. So we know that the oceans are breaking high temperature records. We know that global average temperature is going up and up. We know the ice sheets are melting. We know the polar bears are at risk. We have all of this up here. And as a result, people are becoming very worried, very anxious, very stressed. Climate anxiety, searches for climate anxiety on Google are off the charts. And it's all up here. We have not connected our heads to our hearts and our hearts to our hands. What do I mean by that? Well, everybody can explain. If you ask people on the street, what's happening because of global warming, they'll mention ice sheets and polar bears and maybe sea level rise. But they can't make the head to heart connection. They can't, most people still can't talk about what's happening where they live, to the people they love, or the places they love, or the things they love. Does that mean that the people or places or things we love aren't being affected yet? No! Climate change is already affecting the price of our groceries, for goodness sakes. I was just talking to a colleague who lives in Florida. Her home insurance went from $2,000 a year to $5,000 a year in a single year. And the main reason for that is climate change. Inflation is out of control. And the main reason for inflation today in the last 2 years is fossil fuel prices. So we're all being affected by climate change today, but most people haven't made the head to heart connection because even still, most of the coverage in the media is about stuff up here, not stuff down here. Even if we made the head to heart connection, though, everybody in the world would be worried. And actually, we're rapidly reaching a tipping point where the majority are worried. But if we don't know what to do, we'll do nothing. And so the second essential connection we need to help people make is from the heart to the hands. This is why I care. And because I care, here's what we can do about this together. It's really interesting because for the last 6 or 7 years, the number one question that I've gotten from almost everyone I speak to, and I've been giving about 100 presentations a year for the last 6 or 7 years. I took a break last year because I was getting a little burned out. I only did about 30 or 40 last year instead of 100. But I've been tracking all the questions people ask me for years. I actually often, when I have more people than here, I have a tool I use to actually track the questions. And the number one question that people have been asking me since, 2017, 2018 is, what gives you hope? Or the flip side, are we screwed? I think of those as the same question. What gives you hope, or are we screwed? And how do I talk about this? Well, what's really interesting is the last year, I've been noticing a significant shift. And part of that is because now in a lot of my presentations, I deliberately answer those two questions. I like collecting questions because that's what I take as what I should be talking about. So since I wrote my book, Saving Us, 2 years ago, and if you haven't seen Saving Us, I would encourage you to check it out because it answers those two questions. What gives us hope, or are we screwed? And how do I talk about this to people I love? So let me put a link in here. Let's see. Here's Saving Us. You can get it at your local library, or you can get it as an ebook or an Audible. You don't have to buy a paper book, although it is recycled paper, of course. So since I've started talking more about that, now the number one question I'm getting is different. The number one question I'm getting these days is, what can I do about it? And that is great, because what I interpret that as is people are making the head to heart connection, and extreme weather is a big part of what's helping them make that connection. But then now they instinctively know, I need to make the heart to hands connection, because if I'm just anxious all the time, I'm just going to get more and more anxious, but it's not going to help me fix the problem. The flip side is, and I'm Canadian, as I mentioned before, so I was just talking to some folks in Canada yesterday who've been doing some polling in Canada. And in Canada, we had the terrible wildfire season last year. And I mean, I grew up in Toronto, and I don't remember a single day where the sky was orange. I never saw a single day. Well, there was days and weeks where the sky was so orange that you didn't even want to exercise outside. But what polling in Canada has shown is that people feel so overwhelmed. Yeah, Nova Scotia had wildfires, Northwest Territories had wildfires, British Columbia had wildfires, Ontario and Quebec, like there was wildfires across the whole country. What's been happening is people are so burned out with all the negative news that they're actually starting to dissociate. Dissociation is a human defense mechanism when we haven't made the heart to hands connection. So if we're only talking about how bad it is and how it's affecting the people and places and things we love without telling people what they can do about it, we're not going to get the results we need. We have to be talking, in my opinion, there's no hard and fast number about this, but I generally try to go for 50-50. So I try to go for about 50% why it matters to people, places, and things that we care about. And then 50% what people are already doing and what we can do and what can be done to make a difference. I try to make it about 50-50. It could be 60-40, it could even be 70-30, but keep it in the split there. All right. So that said, let's get started. I'm going to talk, like I said, first of all, about the science of extreme weather, what people are thinking and talking and hearing about extreme weather, and then a little bit more about how to have these positive conversations. Before I get started, though, any questions or thoughts you just wanted to share based on what I just said? Oh, okay. As we go along, if you have a question, go ahead and put it in the chat. After I end each section, I'll stop and look at the chat for a minute. So you can go ahead and do that. I won't be distracted, don't worry. All right, so let me share my screen with you. Okay, here we go. Can everybody see that? Yes? Okay. So I'm going to start off with the really bad news. I'm a big fan of sort of starting bad and then going up from there, right? And the bad news is when we look back at the whole history of our planet, we have never seen this much carbon pollution going into the atmosphere this quickly. The planet has been warmer or cooler before, but it has never had 8 billion people on the planet. And the speed of the change is unprecedented. That's why we have such a problem. And so when people say it's been warmer before, know your answer. You can say, yes, it's been warmer before, but we've never had 8 billion people. And the same scientists who tell us it's been warmer before, because how do they know that? They know that because we study it. The same scientists that told us it's been warmer before are telling us that the rate of warming is unprecedented. And why is this happening? Well, let's be very clear. It is not happening because of plastic pollution. The reason why the planet is warming is because of heat trapping gases. 78% of those heat trapping gases are coming from fossil fuels, coal, gas, and oil, and industry. And 22% are coming from our waste, deforestation, and large-scale industrial agriculture. So that's the split. You can say 3/4, 1/4, you can say 80%, 20%, but that's the split. Fossil fuels is the primary source of the problem. And then we've got the extra icing on the cake, so to speak, from deforestation, large-scale industrial agriculture, and waste. Why does this matter? Explaining what's happening, you can do it in 1 minute with 4 cartoons. And that's what I'm going to do. So our planet has a natural blanket of heat trapping gases that keeps us at just the right temperature for life. The sun's energy shines down and it goes through these heat trapping gases like a window. The earth heats up and gives off heat energy. And just like a blanket traps your body heat on a cold night, the Earth's natural occurring blanket traps the Earth's heat, keeping us at just the right temperature for life. In fact, if we didn't have this natural blanket, our planet would be a frozen ball of ice. So you might say, if this blanket is natural, which it is, and if it's essential for life, which it is, then what's the problem? Well, the problem is that by digging up and burning coal and gas and oil, as you know, that's 78% of the problem. And then through deforestation, large-scale agriculture, and waste, we are producing more of these heat trapping gases. And what they're doing is they are wrapping an extra blanket around the planet that it does not need. And just like you would if somebody snuck into your room at night and put an extra blanket on you, you'd wake up sweating saying, hey, I didn't need this blanket. In the same way, this extra blanket that we are wrapping around our planet is causing it to run a fever. Now, at this point, people might say, well, sure, but I mean, you're just talking about it's only increased by 2 degrees Fahrenheit so far. And maybe it'll get up to 3.5 or 4 degrees Fahrenheit, but there's a bigger temperature difference between the room I'm in and outside. So why does that matter? The difference between climate and weather explains this. Weather is the conditions in a certain place at a certain time. It's like a single tree. Climate is the long-term average of all the conditions over long periods of time. It's like the forest. So one tree could be short or tall, it could be healthy or sick, and that doesn't matter what's happening to the whole forest. But if the whole forest is changing, then that affects everybody in it. The way I think about the 2-degree Fahrenheit warming that we've already seen so far is that over human civilization, 6,000 to 8,000 years, the average temperature of the planet has been as stable as that of the human body. So think about your body temperature. Imagine if your body temperature goes up by 2 degrees Fahrenheit. How do you feel? You feel a little achy, right? You're taking some Tylenol, you're calling the doctor. What happens if your body temperature goes up by 3.5 degrees, which is the 2 degrees Celsius target of the Paris Agreement? 3.5 degrees is a serious fever. You have something really wrong. That's exactly the same as what's happening to our planet. Interestingly, the effect of these temperature changes on the planet are about the same as the same temperature change on our body. So that's a great way to think about it. Okay, so that's what's happening to the planet. Now, let me go on and continue. So what we're seeing in the data is that this is the warmest period as long as we've had humans on the planet, pretty much. And we've never seen warming happening this fast. And in fact, we've never seen this much carbon pollution going into the atmosphere this quickly. And we've never had, like I said, 8 billion people and an $85 trillion economy on the planet when this was happening. So because the main measure of what's happening that scientists use is temperature, people often refer to this as global warming. But I don't like to call this global warming for a couple of different reasons. First of all, I live in Texas, where a number of years ago, I gave a presentation to farmers, one of my 100 presentations a year. I gave a presentation to farmers on how conditions are changing, affecting their crops. And at the end of the presentation, this one farmer came up to me and he said very honestly and very sincerely, he said, well, I have to agree with everything you said. But he said, I would like to agree with everything you said because it just makes sense. But if I agree with you, then I have to agree with what Al Gore says about global warming. And I can't do that because it's such a politicized term. So not only that, but when you say global warming, people say, well, it's cold outside, so where's global warming now? So instead, I prefer to use the term global weirding because wherever we live, things are getting weirder, right? In fact, a couple of years ago, I was actually standing in line to pick up my son at Sunday school, also in West Texas. And the man behind me said, do you mind if I ask you a question? And I was like, well, sure. It's not like we're going anywhere anyways. So he said, do you feel as if the weather has gotten weirder? And now we were in Lubbock, Texas, which a few years before that had won the Weather Channel's national competition for the wildest weather of any city in the country. We beat out Fargo, North Dakota, Fairbanks, Alaska, and Caribou, Maine. I don't know where Caribou, Maine is, but you can just imagine from from the name of the town. Lubbock, Texas won the wildest weather. So we live in the wildest weather town, and he's asking me if the weather's getting weirder. It was getting weirder. I said, our heat wave season is longer, our heat waves are stronger, our heavy downpours are more extreme, our droughts are more intense. I said, I think this is a good way to put it. And we have already seen the signal of weird weather emerging from the noise so much that this man said, I knew it. He said, I've lived here for 30 years and I knew that something was different. And so what I found is that there's no perfect term to talk about this. Like there's no perfect set of words that if you just find the right words, everybody will be like, oh, okay, of course, we get it. Now what do we do? That doesn't exist. But I have found that this is often really helpful for people because global weirding is not a phrase they're familiar with. And so you think of it sort of like people are always looking to pigeonhole ideas and people and things because the faster we pigeonhole, the less thinking we have to do. So think about like you're talking to them. So you're sort of the pigeon in their hand and they're looking to put you in a hole. And if you say global warming, they know immediately what hole to put you in. But if you say global weirding, they don't know what that is. And so the pigeon has to be sitting in their, you being the pigeon, you have to be sitting in their hand longer, so to speak, and they have to ask you more questions to figure out what it is you're talking about before they pigeonhole you. So that's why it's a really good sort of conversation starter, because people don't know what it means. They're sort of curious. And then once you start talking about, are things getting weirder, you can ask them, do you feel like you've got things are getting weirder? And 9 times out of 10, people will have a story themselves about how things are getting weirder. So that's why I like this term, because it's very intuitive, it's very non-political, and people can identify with it and resonate with it. So what do I mean by this? Well, we've always had heat waves, but our heat wave season is getting longer, starting earlier, going later. The heat waves themselves are more intense and more dangerous than they used to be. We've always had wildfires. And most of the wildfires in the lower 48 states are the result of accidental human ignition. About 7 or 8% of the ones in California are arson, but most are accidental human ignition, and then there's some contribution from lightning. Up in Canada and Alaska, it's a lot more lightning because there just aren't very many people up there. So where does climate change come in? Climate change is not starting the fires, but what it's doing is it's making them worse. Imagine if you accidentally dropped a match into a pile of fairly green wet wood. What would happen? Not much. But then imagine you drop the same match into a pile of bone dry kindling that has been baking in record hot, dry conditions for weeks. What happens? A conflagration. That's where climate change comes in. We see that the area burned by wildfires is increasing. We just had the biggest wildfire in Texas history just 2 months ago here in Texas. We see the area burned is increasing. We see that the number of larger fires is increasing. We see that fire weather is increasing. And so the intensity and the speed at which fires burn is also increasing. What about droughts? Well, most droughts occur naturally. But once they occur, there's this vicious cycle between heat and drought that makes them longer and more intense than they would be otherwise. So the drought happens, but because it's happening in a warmer world, it's longer and stronger than it would have been 50 or 100 years ago. How about hurricanes? Hurricanes, and they're also called typhoons and cyclones in different parts of the world. Hurricanes are a unique type of storm that are powered by warm ocean water. They are literally powered by the ocean. And so when a hurricane moves over land, it's unplugging from its power source. So that's why when a hurricane moves over land, it's already starting to peter out. It can still remain there for a couple of days as it moves across, dumping a lot of rain. But the tight circular formation will start to disintegrate because it's unplugged from its power source. So we don't see a big change in the number of hurricanes. There's a lot of different factors that go into why a hurricane forms, and climate change is pushing some of those factors up and it's pushing some of them down. So we don't see a change in the number of hurricanes. But what we do see is when the hurricane forms, as they always do, there's a lot more heat in the ocean. In fact, earlier I talked about how we're wrapping that blanket of carbon pollution around the planet, and it's trapping a lot of extra heat. 90% of the extra heat that blanket is trapping is going into the ocean. Isn't that wild? So all of this stuff that we see happening up here with our heat waves and, our wildfires and all the hot, dry conditions we're seeing and the heavy downpours, all of that is being powered by just a few percent of the heat that's being trapped by that blanket. 90% of it's going into the ocean. And so with all that extra heat in the ocean, when the hurricane forms, it's plugged into the ocean. What do you think is happening? There's a lot more energy coming out that plug into the hurricane. Have you ever taken a North American hairdryer over to Europe and plugged it in? If you have, you will never forget it, because A, it dries your hair in half the time, and then B, it explodes. Why? Because the current there is a lot stronger. It's twice as strong. And if the hairdryer is not made for that current, it'll give you a lot more heat and then it'll just blow. So that's sort of what's happening with the hurricanes. They're getting bigger and they're getting stronger and they're dropping a lot more rain than they used to. And they're even getting slower because they're being fed by warmer ocean conditions. Atmospheric rivers are often a big source of flooding for the whole West Coast, all the way from British Columbia down to California and Mexico. Atmospheric rivers are also getting stronger. They're literally rivers of water vapor in the sky that when they hit the mountains that go all the way along the coast, all the way from Mexico up to Alaska, there's a row of mountains along the coast. So the atmospheric river comes, it hits the mountains, it rises. As air rises, it cools, the water condenses, and it dumps. Massive amounts of flooding, and it's getting worse under climate change. Lastly, heavy rain. Now, this relates to atmospheric rivers, it relates to hurricanes, and it just relates to regular rainstorms too. Warmer air holds more water vapor. So as the world gets warmer, there's more water vapor up there when any storm comes along for that storm to pick up and dump on us. This is true for hurricanes, it's true for atmospheric rivers, and it's true for normal storms too. So the average amount of rainfall during normal storms is going up too because warmer air holds more water vapor. One of the ways I think about it is, imagine that wherever we live, we already have a set of weather dice. And we naturally can always roll a double six. You can, naturally have a heat wave, a drought, a flood, a hurricane, a wildfire, or more. But as the world warms decade by decade, it's sneaking in and it's taking one of the other numbers on our dice and turning it into another six. And then it's coming in and taking another number and turning it into another six. And then it's even taking one number or two and turning them into sevens or eights. And so all of a sudden people are like, how could we just have 3 500-year flood events in 3 years? That's global weirding. All right, let me stop here briefly before I start going into how we tie this in detail more to climate change. Any other nice comments here? Any questions or clarifications? This is your chance. Anything that wasn't clear that you want me to go over or explain? Okay, just seeing a lot of head shaking. Oh, go ahead, Deanna.
Yeah, I have a question. This is fantastic. Thank you so much. On the terminology, where does climate change fit into that? I know you use global weirding most often, it sounds like, but how do you find that folks are across the country are relating to climate change?
So most people these days have heard the phrase climate change quite a bit. So it's no longer a foreign term. And in fact, there's this whole conspiracy theory about how climate scientists changed the name from global warming to climate change. Not true. Climate change is a more neutral scientific term for any long-term change in conditions that could occur naturally or due to humans. So it's sort of a more generic term. But of course, it's rapidly becoming a bit more politicized too. So if people are already on board with climate change and they're already sort of concerned about it, then I would use climate change for sure, because I just think it's sort of the most scientifically accurate term. But if people haven't quite made that connection and aren't really sure about the whole thing, then using a term that they're not familiar with keeps that pigeon in the hand for longer before they shove it into, oh, they're just a bunch of liberal Democrats, I don't want to talk to them. Pigeonhole. In fact, one of the things I talk about in my book is how I once gave a presentation. Well, I was experimenting with this. So I had to speak to a large group of water managers in Texas. And water managers in Texas are very important because we never have enough water until we have too much. And so water managers are sort of like the lifeblood. They manage the lifeblood of the state. You might think it's oil. It isn't. It's water. So I was at their annual meeting, and I was due to talk right after one state representative and one state senator, both of whom explicitly deny the reality of human-caused climate change. And then there was I coming up after. So I decided that I was going to try something new for that audience. I was going to try talking about everything I would normally talk about without mentioning the words climate and change in sequence. So I talked about climate variability. I talked about long-term change. I talked about trends. I talked about global weirding. But I didn't change any of the other content. I even showed climate model projections. I definitely showed how it was getting warmer. So I talked about all of that. And then at the end, I still remember this lady came running up to me and she grabbed my hand and she shook it. And she said, oh, just a second, it's the first one. The first one. She grabbed my hand and she shook it and she said, that was great. She said, I agree with everything you said. And then she said, but those people who talk about global warming, I don't agree with them at all. But she said, but this makes sense. And I've even found that when we're using a term that people have already pigeonholed, that they won't listen to anything we say because they think they already know what we're going to say. So what happened was with this lady, by never using those words that would have caused her to pigeonhole me, she actually listened to what I was saying. And because she listened to what I was saying, she actually agreed with it. So again, there's no magic word, and it really depends on who you're talking to and why. But there's power in the way that we frame things, in the stories we tell, in the words we use. And I always try to think really carefully about that. And I try to find out as much as I can about who I'm speaking with to figure out what's the best way to keep that pigeon in the hand as long as possible.
Thank you.
Yes, exactly. Okay, so let me dig a little bit more into this now, because every time there's an extreme weather event, reporters call up climate scientists. And 5 or 10 years ago, every time I got a call, this is what I would say. And I know for a fact that every other climate scientist who got a call would be saying the same thing. We would literally say, it was like the standard statement. We would say, they call up and they say, was this flood climate change? And we would say, we cannot attribute any individual event to human-induced climate change, but over climate timescales of 2 decades or more, we know that, and then we would insert, the hurricanes are getting stronger, or heavy rainfall is more frequent, or, heat waves are more dangerous. Emphasis on used to. Because in my opinion, one of the biggest and most important advances that has been made in climate science over the last 5 or 6 years is in the field of individual event attribution. What that means is for an individual event, we can put a number on how much worse climate change made it. Now, originally, the first attribution studies were on the probability. Climate change made this event 5 times more likely, or 15 times more likely, or 150 times more likely. But we've advanced. Now we can actually calculate how much hotter the heat wave was, how much rain fell, more rain fell than would have without human-caused climate change. We can go further. We can calculate how much more area flooded. We can even calculate how much greater the economic damages were. And at the same time that this has been going on with attribution of individual events, over on the far other side of the equation, led initially by a study 10 years ago by the Union of Concerned Scientists and Richard Heed and the Carbon Accountability Institute, we've been able to put numbers on which companies contributed to this problem. And so you can now match up which companies and which impacts, and you can actually start putting the numbers together. And there's a book that I highly recommend if you have not read it yet. It's called Angry Weather. I'll put a link in the chat, by Freddie Otto. Freddie leads the World Weather Attribution Center, and I highly recommend following World Weather Attribution too, because they do very rapid attribution on global events. And in this book, she explains how we put a number on individual events. And after I read the book, my number one reaction is, there has gotta be some really smart lawyers who are reading this book and putting this together with the culpability and responsibility. And I just think that I am really surprised. I know we have seen some lawsuits already. I've actually helped with some of them over the past few decade or more, but I just feel like we are really connecting the dots on this. So let me show you a couple of the dots that we're connecting here. Going back to where we were on the PowerPoint. Okay. We talked about how climate change is taking these events and making them worse. And then, we have 2023, which was just off the charts. Now, is every year going to be as off the charts as 2023? No, but year by year, we're seeing more and more years that are off the charts because we're rolling the dice, right? Some years we get, some 5s and 4s and 3s showing up on the dice. And some years like last year, it's all the 6, 7s and 8s showing up. So in the US, back in the 1980s, there was $1 billion weather and climate disaster on average every 4 months, accounting for how the value of the dollar has changed over time. By the 2010s, there was one every 2.8 weeks, and last year there was one every 1.8 weeks. That is a crazy change. So I mentioned that originally, most of our focus was on how much more likely climate change made a given event. The German floods in 2021, 9 times more likely. The heat wave and wildfires in the Pacific Northwest and lower British Columbia, 150 times more likely. But now, like I said, we can actually get into how much hotter the heat wave is, how much more rain was dumped. We can get into the actual dollars that were caused by climate change as opposed to not. And this was a study that came out last May. This was also by scientists at the Union of Concerned Scientists. They actually tagged 1/3 of the wildfire area burned across Western North America to 88 companies. That is just, in my mind, that is stunning. That to me is mind-blowing. So this connection is right there. Now, I mentioned earlier how when I was back here, there we go. I mentioned earlier here how most of the time these events would have occurred naturally, but climate change is making them worse. It's sort of like a baseball player on steroids. The baseball player would have hit the ball, but the steroids is turning it into a home run, right? So we would have had the hurricane, but it wouldn't be so bad. We would have had, we wouldn't have had as many heat waves, but we still would have had some. We would have definitely had the drought, but it wouldn't be as bad. You know what I mean? And somebody still would have dropped a match, but it wouldn't have been an out of control wildfire. So most cases, we still would have the event, but it just wouldn't be nearly as bad. But what Freddie's work has shown, sorry, skipping ahead here, this is from Freddie Otto's work. And this is looking at the current drought in Syria, Iraq, and Iran. And what they have showed, if you look on the right-hand side, is that it is currently an extreme drought. So there's the drought severity goes from abnormal, moderate, severe, extreme, exceptional. It is currently an extreme drought. And what their analysis showed is before the observed warming that's already happening today, it wouldn't have been a drought. So this would not have been a drought without the warming. So what are we seeing? We're seeing the further we go through time, the more events like this, especially droughts and heat waves and heavy rain events and floods, more and more of these are going to be happening that would not have happened without climate change. Like I said, remember the wildfires are mostly accidental human ignition in the lower 48 states. But up north, the lightning patterns are changing. So we will see more wildfires in a lot of sort of more northern areas also because of climate change. And remember I said the number of hurricanes isn't changing, but we're just seeing more frequent and more dangerous, more damaging hurricanes. So those are the latest nuances. All right, so now let's talk a little bit about what's happening. Are people noticing? So this is an Associated Press poll they did last September. So about 5 months ago. 74% of US adults said that they've been affected by hot weather. Hot weather was the number one thing that they've been affected by. A number of others also said they've been affected by droughts, hurricanes, flooding, wildfires, other severe weather events. All told, 9 out of 10 Americans said that they had been personally affected by weather extremes, and 2/3 of them connected it to climate change. So this is a huge opportunity. 9 out of 10 have been affected and 2/3 connected to climate change. But remember again, what I mentioned about Canada in the beginning, there's the concern about exhaustion. There's a concern about people just dissociating. So they're making the head to heart connection, but if we don't help them make the heart to hands connection, they dissociate. They're aware of the problem. They're even worried about the problem, but they're just exhausted and overloaded and anxious, and they check out. So this is not the be all and end all, but it is at least a first start at the head to heart connection. And then 2 years ago, the Yale program on climate communication that does a lot of the polling I use, they asked people what's the greatest threat from global warming, and the number one answer they got was weather extremes. That was the number one answer. The number two answer was it's not a threat. But that's a lot smaller. So, 20%, and this was 2 years ago, if I had to guess, I think we'd probably be up to 25 or 30% now, if not more. But Max Boykoff at the University of Chicago, Colorado, tracks major media mentions of climate change. And he found that this year, 2023, the worst year on record for weather extremes, supersized by climate change, newspaper coverage was down. And he redid this internationally. Guess what? It was down internationally too. Wild. And so the Yale program on climate communication just released their latest polling data, and they asked people, do you hear about global warming in the media at least once a week? Most people's answer is no. Media Matters just released their review of the major news networks, CBS, NBC, ABC, Fox, and PBS NewsHour. I have a big thread on that on social media if you're interested. And they found that coverage also dropped last year. The most coverage was PBS NewsHour. It was almost the same amount as every other station put together. And then the biggest for-profit coverage of climate was CBS. And actually just met with CBS's climate desk yesterday, and we had a great conversation about how they want to do more. Is this unique to the US? No. All of the countries that are most vulnerable to climate impacts hear almost nothing about climate change. It's only in Western Europe that we are just barely over the 50% mark. And if you look at the darkest countries correlate the darkest red countries, Sweden, Finland, Germany, Austria, they correlate very highly with where conversations are happening among everyday people. And they also correlate very highly with where a number of really concerned young people live who, in my opinion, kickstarted the conversation. I think in this map, we're looking at the influence of just a very small handful of young people led by Greta Thunberg. That's my opinion. Not an official polling result. So why do we care about this? We care about it because it's affecting our food, it's affecting our water, it's affecting the air that we breathe. Millions of people die from breathing in air pollution from fossil fuels. The same amount every year has died from COVID the first year of the pandemic, and nobody knows this. It affects all the buildings and roads and systems we use. Every day, I've already had to do this today. I did a Weather Channel interview this morning, and I had to do this morning. Every day, I have to tell people, it is not about saving the planet. The planet will be orbiting the sun long after we're gone. It is not like people or the planet, the environment or the economy. The question is, will we? We cannot survive in outer space without the resources this planet provides. I put an asterisk on us because I don't mean only humans. Where does the oxygen we breathe come from? Half of it comes from phytoplankton in the ocean. The rest of it comes from trees and plants. Nature does not need us. We need it. We can't survive without it. So we have to show people, and this is the head to heart, we have to show people it is about us. We are the ones at risk. The people, the places, the things we love, that is what is at risk. And what that means is, and this is very important, it means that who somebody already is, as long as they're a human being living on this planet, if they are a human being on this planet, breathing the air, drinking the water, eating the food, they're the perfect person to care about climate change because they're already being affected by it and they have the power to do something about it. So this is really important because it cuts across all partisan divides to really focus on what we share as humans. And research has shown is that the more we can bring this down to the local level, the more powerful it is. There's a reason why mayors are not nearly as partisan as governors, and governors, of course, are very partisan, but then compare that to the national scale. The closer you get to where people live, the more you can engage people's hearts. And that's so important on this issue. All right, let me stop briefly here because I just have a couple of more minutes at the end to talk about, how do we talk about this? But let me stop here. Questions, thoughts, feedback, ideas.
I have one. Hi, Sierra. I'm sorry I was a touch late.
Oh, no worries.
I'm doing extreme weather survivors. So our organization connects communities that have survived floods, fires, extreme heat. And a lot of our work is really in providing support, trauma-informed support and shared learnings, that kind of thing. What I guess one of my first questions is, I'm really interested in air pollution by fires. How do you, and a lot of what we're doing, sorry, the other piece is that we're putting people on TV proactively. So we're proactively booking survivors to go on TV and to connect the dots for people. And so I'm really interested in air pollution by fires because I think that feels novel for people. Unlike hurricanes and floods, unfortunately, and fires, those do sort of, I do talk to some people who don't think of it as connected to climate change right away because they're like, these have happened for a long time, especially in California or whatever. But so air pollution from fires specifically feels so novel and new. Like a third of our country was under terrible air pollution. Do you have a, how is the attribution from that? I mean, I imagine it's the same as fire. Is there any other guidance? Anyone else you would mention in that sort of lane?
It comes from wildfires. So when we say that a third of the area burned across Western North America is attributable to 88 fossil fuel companies, then that's the same as the wildfire smoke. When we also say that, how much is increasing. So like for California, there's this pie chart that shows how the biggest fires in California, oh, here it is. Yes. Oh my gosh, this is insane. So this is an old pie chart, but I'm just going to show this here so you get an idea for California. Here we go. Let me share my screen. There we go. So this is for California. This is only through 2021, but this is the 20 largest California wildfires. So if people say, well, we've always had wildfires, your answer is yes, and they're getting bigger. Look at this. More than half the pie happened in 2 years. So isn't that wild? Here, let's see, copy image address. I'll put this in the chat here. Okay. So yeah, so that's where the attribution would just totally follow wildfires. Okay, let's see, extreme heat and weather events, yes. Oh yes, there is a lot of research on how climate change affects us all, but it doesn't affect us all equally. In fact, if you can memorize that statement, I would. Climate change affects us all, but it doesn't affect us all equally. And the reason why I'm a climate scientist is because of that. When I found out how unfair climate change was, that is what led me to become a climate scientist. I was actually planning to be an astrophysicist. In fact, if you've watched Don't Look Up, the girl's like sitting there at the beginning. She's like a graduate student. She's sitting there in the dome. That was me. Which is really freaky because her name's Kate, right? So that was my job. But when I realized how unfair climate change was, I figured I had to do the second part of her job, which is telling everybody how bad it is, but also what they didn't do in that movie, and they really missed an opportunity, which is showing people what they could do to make a difference. That movie connected head to heart, but it did not connect head to hands. In fact, in my opinion, it took a giant set of shears and it chopped any connection between head and hands because there's nothing you can do about a comet hitting the Earth, or an asteroid. Anyways, sorry, slight digression there. So climate change affects us all, but it doesn't affect us all equally. And back in the 1990s, the biggest socioeconomic inequalities were between country. 2/3 of the biggest socioeconomic inequalities in the world were between rich and poor countries. But when you say socioeconomic, there's huge racial differences between those countries. The richest countries were the white countries, the poorest countries were the Southeast Asian and African countries. Fast forward to today, it's flipped. 2/3 of the socioeconomic differences are now within country. And when they're happening within country, who do you think are the wealthy neighborhoods and who do you think are the poor neighborhoods? The Black and brown neighborhoods are the ones who are most affected, and they also, uncoincidentally, are often the lowest socioeconomic neighborhoods, so they have the least resources to adapt. So let me give you a couple of tangible examples. Low-income neighborhoods in the same city can be up to 15 degrees Fahrenheit hotter during a heat wave than a high-income neighborhood in the same city. And that is because of lack of green space, which is because of racist redlining practices. Not only that, but low-income neighborhoods are often more likely to flood. Why? Because nobody wanted to live in the flood zone. So the land was cheaper, and that was the only place they could afford to live. Then those places typically have much worse air pollution because, as you know, they cut highways right through them. They located landfills and hazardous waste dumps and toxic factories in them because people didn't have the political clout to say no, that the richer neighborhoods did. And so when climate change happens, when a hurricane hits, when heavy downpour hits, when anything hits, those neighborhoods are more vulnerable and the impacts are greater. There was even an interaction with COVID. People who were more exposed to air pollution were much more likely to contract COVID, to get very sick from COVID, and even to die from COVID if their lungs had already been harmed by air pollution, which again comes primarily from fossil fuels. So there is a huge correlation, to answer your question, Patricia, and there is a large body of literature, an absolutely huge body of literature showing very clearly that within country, as well as between countries, people of color, people who are marginalized, women and children more than men, people who are Black and brown more than people who are white. There's a just new emerging body of literature that I knew had to be coming, showing how LGBTQ people are more affected because they don't have the community connections either. So basically, anyone who is marginalized is automatically more vulnerable. All right, Aaron, you've been waiting a while.
Thanks so much. This is also incredibly helpful. Quick question on causation in the litigation space. If you were going to have a case about one particular event and the specific harm that it caused, what is the kind of climate-induced weather disaster that the attribution is the strongest? So if you're going to just choose the thing that has the best chance of surviving a causation critique in the courts, what would that event be?
That is a great question. So the science is getting pretty solid on a lot of different events. I would say that it depends. So, you know, the California drought they had for multiple years, it occurred naturally, but it was made worse because of climate change. Whereas the Syria drought I just showed you, it wouldn't have been a drought without climate change. So to a certain extent, the answer is it depends whether it occurred naturally and got worse or whether it wouldn't have even occurred without climate change. But in general, you know, heat waves and hurricanes are pretty solid. There's a lot of good peer-reviewed literature on heat waves and hurricanes. Wildfires, I think, are there, but you know, where the smoke goes depends on the weather pattern. So if you're doing smoke-related injuries where the weather patterns caused by climate change, it might get a little bit more dicey there in terms of drawing the connections. The directer the connections, the better, basically. Like if your home was flooded by the hurricane sitting over your home, it's very different than if you're in New York City with the wildfire smoke from Northwest Territories getting all the way to your home. So you have to look at a bunch of different factors, I think. But again, with heat waves, hurricanes, with floods, urbanization also plays a role. So how much do you blame the development laws in the city? How much do you blame the heavy rainfall? The more factors there are in there, the messier it gets. So even for a certain event, who, where, what, and why might be easier for one group rather than another to hold up in court of law.
Between hurricanes and heat waves, is there one, like someone dies clearly from a hurricane, someone dies clearly from overheating an extreme heat event? Which of those would you, if you had to choose one to build a case around, which one would you choose?
Oh, if somebody died, I would definitely choose heat, because the thing is with the hurricane, what actually killed them? Like, was it poor construction of the house? You know, could you actually conceivably blame the builder or the city planner? So that's, if it's flood damage, like dollar signs on flood damage with a hurricane, that would be one thing. But if it's actual human death, that would be harder, because it's like, well, you know, what if they just went outside when they weren't supposed to? What if they didn't hear the warnings and they actually got warnings? Or what if they didn't get warnings? Whereas with the heat, it's so large and there's nowhere for people to go.
Hey, I am so sorry to interrupt, but it's 2 minutes to the hour, and I assume you have a hard stop, Catherine?
Pretty hard,
Pretty
yes.
hard, yeah. Well, I just wanted to say thank you. This has been such a joy. And for me, one of the greatest contributions that you make is always you come with a metaphor, whether it's the loaded dice analogy or the baseball player on steroids. I don't even know what baseball really is, but I get the analogy, right?
Yes.
And then what was the other one that you had, which was awesome? Oh, the fever. I mean, yeah, I had like autoimmune stuff for a while. My temperature was just 1.5 degrees more than normal, and I felt so bad. So it's a really powerful one. And yeah, I just, yeah, giving 100 presentations a year is not sustainable. Thank you for doing this one. So that's really amazing. And I just wanted to close with a quick quote just for, um, food for thought. This is from Naomi Oreskes, and Eric Conway's book, The Collapse of Western Civilization. And in it, they just have this very provocative line in terms of what we've been talking about. And that is, um, the physical scientists studying these steadily increasing disasters did not help quell the denial and instead became entangled in arcane arguments about the attribution of singular events. Of course, the threat to civilization inhered not in any individual flood, heat wave, or hurricane, but in the overall shifting climate pattern, its impact on the cryosphere, and the increasing acidification of the world ocean. Um, I just by chance, happened to read that last night. So would love to hear your thoughts at a later date about that passage. But I think we can do, it's not either or, it's both and. And you're a great example of being able to walk both sides of that conversation. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Clara. This has been so great. One quick last question for you, Sarah. The World Weather Attribution site is the place you want to go for rapid attribution. I'll pop a link in the chat. And then I just put a link in the chat too to my weekly newsletter that I do specifically to help share good news about climate solutions, not so good news about why it matters and what we can do. So check that out. And remember, when we share this information, actually, let me pop my slides up for one more second because I want to show you one more cool thing. When I ask people how they feel about climate change these days, this is the answer I get. Everybody says some variant of this. But when we help them make the head to heart to hands connection, and I ask them afterwards how they feel about climate change, this is what I get. It doesn't change everybody, but it changes most people. And honestly, I don't even necessarily want people to say they feel hopeful. I want them to feel motivated and empowered and determined. And that's what we see there. So that's what all of us can do. Thank you so much.
Thanks everybody for being here. I'll have the recording to share soon.